Master Chief Grant Wilder looked at her the way men like him always looked at women who showed up in places they didn't expect, with that particular brand of amusement that lives just one layer above contempt. She was standing at the tailgate of a dusty pickup truck, doing something nobody in the tactical staging area had time to watch closely. Not in the middle of a hostage crisis. Not with 5 civilians trapped in a building 400 meters away, and 12 armed separatists between them and any chance of walking out alive. But Wilder watched. He watched her pull a rifle case from behind the rear seat. Watched her set it on the tailgate with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Watched her pop the latches without looking down, her eyes already moving across the ridgeline, reading the terrain the way other people read a map. He walked over, because men like Wilder always walk over. "Ma'am." His voice carried that specific texture, polite on the surface, something harder underneath. "I'm going to need you to step back from the perimeter." She didn't look at him. She was running her thumb along the rifle's action, checking the bolt. "I designed this facility," she said. "I know every room in that building, every window, every sideline." "That's great." Wilder crossed his arms. Behind him, 3 of his operators had stopped moving. The junior ones always did when he went to work. "But we've got a tactical team ready to breach, and civilian contractors standing at tailgates holding rifles is not something I need right now." She finally looked at him. Her right eye had a faint scar running above the brow, old, well-healed, the kind that came from something that happened a long time ago. Her left eye was calm, almost bored. "There are 5 hostages," she said, 5 captors holding them in separate rooms on the east face. "Your breach team goes through that front door, and 2 of those hostages are dead before your point man clears the entry hall. The angles are wrong. The walls are wrong. You don't know this building." Wilder smiled, not warmly. "You know what I do know?" He stepped closer. "I know my team has 47 successful hostage extractions between them. I know we've been training for exactly this scenario for 6 months. And I know," he let his eyes drop briefly to the rifle, then back to her face, "that whatever you think you're going to do with that from 400 meters, you're not going to do it. A bit. You'll miss, sweetheart." She looked at him for one more second. Then she turned back to her rifle, seated the magazine, chambered around, and said nothing. Wilder shook his head and walked back to his team. 19 minutes later, 5 men were dead. Not one of them was a hostage. And the only sounds in the staging area were the wind moving through the pines and the absolute silence of 12 special operations operators who did not know what to say. But before I tell you what happened in those 19 minutes, before I tell you who Mara Cole really was, and why Grant Wilder would spend the rest of his career trying to forget that Tuesday in November, I need you to understand something about the 4 years that came before it. Because the 5 shots were not the story. The story was everything that made those 5 shots possible. Subscribe right now and stay until the end of this one. What happens in the debrief room 2 hours after those shots are fired will leave you completely speechless. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Mara Cole's story travels. Now, let's go back to where it really started. Mara Cole has been invisible for 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She knew the exact number because she had counted them the way some people count calories or miles, not obsessively, but with a kind of methodical honesty that comes from understanding yourself too well. She wasn't hiding, not exactly. Hiding implied fear, and what Mara felt wasn't fear. It was closer to a decision, a deliberate subtraction of herself from a world that had decided she was no longer useful. The Rocky Mountain Special Operations Training Center, sat at 8,400 feet above sea level in the San Isabel National Forest, 40 minutes from the nearest town, with the gas station, and 2 hours from anything that might reasonably be called a city. Mara had taken the job as a civilian tactical consultant 18 months earlier, after a brief stint doing security assessments for a private firm in Denver that had bored her out of her mind. The facility trained Joint Special Operations units in mountain warfare, extreme environment navigation, and hostage rescue scenarios. It was, in the language of military bureaucracy, a Tier 2 support installation, important enough to have a proper budget, obscure enough that nobody with political ambitions ever wanted to visit. That suited Mara perfectly. She lived in a converted ranger cabin 3 miles up the access road. She drove a 12-year-old pickup that she maintained herself. She kept a garden in the summer, tomatoes mostly, and one stubborn rosemary bush that her grandfather had told her would never survive at altitude, which meant she had been proving him wrong for 15 months now. She ran 8 miles every morning at 05:30 in the dark, in weather that ranged from merely cold to aggressively hostile. She cooked her own meals. She read history. She slept well. From the outside, it looked like peace. From the inside, it looked like someone who had learned to occupy only the space they were given. The space Mara had been given was not the space she had earned. She had enlisted in the Marine Corps at 18, the year her grandfather retired from his second career as a firearms instructor at a ranch in Wyoming. James Cole had been a scout sniper with 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines in Vietnam. One of those men who came back from that war quieter than they'd left, but somehow more complete, as if the experience had burned away everything that wasn't essential and left only the core. He'd spent 30 years teaching his granddaughter what the essential things were: how to read wind, how to read terrain, how to read people. Most people, he told her when she was 11, lying prone on a wooden platform he'd built at the back of his property. The old Remington 700 feeling enormous against her thin shoulder, think shooting is about the trigger. It's not about the trigger. The trigger is just the last thing that happens. Everything before the trigger, that's the real work. She remembered asking him what the real work was. Patience, he said, and honesty. Being honest about what you're actually seeing, not what you want to see. She had been thinking about that distinction ever since. She had been thinking about it specifically for the last 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Because 4 years ago, Mara Cole had been brutally honest about what she was seeing, and the United States Marine Corps had decided they preferred what they wanted to see instead. She had made Force Recon at 26. The first woman to complete the full selection pipeline, not in the modified version that had existed during the earlier years of the program, but the actual course, 37 days of the kind of physical and psychological attrition that removed approximately 70% of the men who attempted it. She had not mentioned this to anyone at the training center, not because she was ashamed of it, but because it had stopped feeling like something that needed to be said, a medal you wore on the inside. Her record in the field over the following 10 years was classified at a level that meant most of the people who might want to look it up couldn't, and the ones who could weren't in the habit of discussing it. She had deployed 6 times across 3 theaters. She had worked in roles that didn't have clean names in the official literature. The kind of work that happened in the space between what was authorized and what was necessary. Her specialty was precision fire at extreme angles and distances, not the long-range shooting that made headlines in the military press, not the 1,000-yard shots that got written up in training manuals. Her specialty was the ugly geometry of real combat, the hostage behind the pillar at an odd angle, The high-value target who never stood in the open. The shot that required not just accuracy, but a specific and unorthodox understanding of physics, architecture, nature, and human behavior. She had made those shots in those circumstances 11 times across 6 deployments. 0 civilian casualties, 0 friendly casualties. It was the kind of record that under normal circumstances would have been impossible to force out. But the circumstances had not been normal. Syria, November, 4.5 years ago. She had been attached as a fire support specialist to a joint task force running interdiction operations in the northeastern corridor. The mission was straightforward on paper. Disrupt weapons movement, gather intelligence on transit routes, avoid direct engagement whenever possible. The mission had not remained straightforward. On the 4th day of operations, she had been positioned on overwatch at 1,100 meters. When the task force commander, Master Chief Grant Wilder, on detachment from SEAL Team 3, had made a decision that wasn't in the operational parameters. She had watched it through her scope. She had watched it the way her grandfather had taught her to watch things. Honestly, without letting what she wanted to see replace what she was actually seeing. And what she was actually seeing was 8 men on their knees, unarmed, hands bound. They were not fighters. She had studied them for 40 minutes before the rest of the team arrived, had confirmed through their behavior and their dress and the absence of any weapons in their compound that they were farmers, local men who had the bad luck to be near a transit route that Wilder's intelligence had once again gotten wrong. She watched Wilder make his decision. She had 37 seconds to report what she saw before it was over. She had spent every one of those seconds trying to raise anyone on the command net who could authorize an abort. The frequency was jammed. She would later learn it had been jammed deliberately, though proving that would take two years and the intervention of a Department of Justice investigator she had not yet met. What happened in those 37 seconds was the kind of thing that rewrites the rest of a person's life. She had filed her report within 6 hours of returning to the forward operating base. Detailed, precise, written in the flat factual language that after-action reports required. It documented what she had seen, the timeline, the grid coordinates, the absence of weapons, and the identities of the men she had observed making the decision. The report was received by her commanding officer at 23:40 hours. By 800 the following morning, she had been pulled from operations pending a medical review. The review was conducted by a military physician named Dr. Leonard Krauss, whom she had never met before and never met again after. It lasted 45 minutes. The conclusion, delivered with the practiced neutrality of a man reading from a form he had already filled out, was that the scar above her right eye, sustained during a training exercise 6 years earlier, fully healed, never once affected her operational performance, had resulted in a level of monocular vision degradation that rendered her unfit for precision fire roles. Her request for a second opinion was denied on procedural grounds. Her report was filed, stamped, and disappeared into a classification system from which it would not emerge for 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Her discharge was honorable. Her service record was impeccable, and the single line that had been added to her medical file, vision impairment, right eye, operational disqualification, was the most precisely deployed weapon she had ever seen used against a human being. She had not fought it, not because she didn't know what had happened. She knew exactly what had happened. But fighting it required resources she didn't have, and more importantly, it required her to keep standing in the open, while people who had already demonstrated their willingness to bury inconvenient things took aim at the rest of her life. She had made a decision instead. She had subtracted herself, become invisible, taken the job as the training center where nobody of importance ever came, done the work quietly and competently, and waited for something she couldn't have named to change. She had not known what she was waiting for. She had not known it had a name. The training center had 3 full-time instructors, one administrative coordinator named Fola, who was the sharpest person at the facility by a significant margin, and Mara, whose official title was Tactical Environment Design Specialist, which meant she built the scenarios that other people trained in. She was very good at this. She was good at it because designing a scenario required understanding every possible way it could go wrong, which required understanding the facility, its architecture, its topography, its sightlines, at a level of depth that went far beyond what was needed for simple instruction. She had spent 18 months mapping every room of the main training building. She knew that the east face had 5 rooms on the 2nd floor, each with a single window, each window facing outward at a slightly different angle from the others. She knew that the windows were 16 inches wide and 22 inches tall, deliberately narrow, the way real operational environments tended to be. She knew that the angles from the tree line to the northwest made clean shots through those windows technically possible at approximately 390 meters, if you accounted for the slight left-to-right crosswind that came up the ridge every afternoon between 1100 and 1600 hours. She had designed a scenario around exactly those windows, exactly those angles, exactly that crosswind. She had designed it for the teams that trained here. She had never expected to need it herself. The separatists arrived on a Tuesday. They were not technically separatists. They were a domestic extremist group called the Cascade Covenant, a name that would have sounded almost poetic if the 12 men who made it up hadn't been armed with military surplus weapons and motivated by a grievance list that had been building for 3 years. Their target was not the training center itself. Their target was one specific person who was attending a week-long consultation at the facility, a man named Douglas Hartley, Senior Investigative Counsel for the Department of Justice's National Security Division, who had arrived on Monday with 2 junior staffers and had spent his first day in quiet conversations with Mara that she had not entirely understood the significance of. She understood it now. Hartley had come to the facility because it was remote, because it was secure, and because he had learned 3 weeks earlier that someone in the intelligence community had flagged his investigation and begun to monitor his communications. He had come to the mountains to conduct interviews away from surveillance. He had come specifically to talk to Mara Cole. He had not told her this directly. He had approached it carefully, the way a man who spent his career building cases learned to approach the witnesses who didn't know they were witnesses yet. He had started with questions about her service record, about Syria, about what she remembered from the 4th day of that November operation. He had not gotten to the part where he told her why he was asking. The Cascade Covenant had arrived before he could. It happened fast, the way these things always happen faster than anyone expected. Not because the planning was particularly sophisticated, but because people in training environments existed in a specific kind of complacency. They were always prepared for the simulated emergency, and the simulation occupied so much mental bandwidth that the real emergency had a window before the brain caught up. 12 men, 3 vehicles. They came through the main gate at 08:47 when the facility's security detail was rotating shifts, and they were through the perimeter before anyone registered that the vehicles were wrong. By 8:52, they had the main building. By 900, they had 5 hostages, Hartley and his 2 staffers, plus 2 facility staff members named Chen and Rodriguez, who had the misfortune of being in the building when the doors closed. Mara was not in the building. She had been in the equipment barn doing her morning inventory when she heard the first shot, she had not panicked. She had gone to her truck, retrieved her grandfather's Remington 700 from behind the rear seat, and begun assessing the situation with the same methodical honesty that James Cole had taught her on a wooden platform in Wyoming 27 years earlier. She had been doing this for 11 minutes when the tactical vehicles arrived. Wilder's team came in 3 vehicles, 2 black SUVs and a tactical truck with equipment that suggested they had come prepared for a breach. They had staging set up in 6 minutes, which was fast, and Mara watched them work with the practiced eye of someone who had done this herself and knew what competence looked like. They were competent. They were also about to make a significant error. She had counted the hostage positions through her spotting scope. She had identified the room assignments. She had mapped the approach angles. And she had reached a conclusion that their breach plan, entry through the front door, rapid room clearance, standard hostage rescue protocol, would not survive contact with the actual geometry of the situation. The east face, 5 windows, 5 captors using the hostages as shields, positioned in a configuration that made simultaneous breaching impossible. The moment the first door went down, the other 4 would know, and the moment the other 4 knew, 2 of those hostages would not survive the next 30 seconds. She had walked toward Wilder's staging position because she had information they needed. She had not expected what she got instead. Chief Andy Torres was the first to notice her approaching. He was Wilder's second, 42 years old. 2 tours of Iraq and 3 of Afghanistan, with the kind of face that had stopped registering surprise at anything. He watched her come across the gravel with the rifle and the spotting scope and the expression of someone with a specific purpose, and he nudged Wilder without comment. Wilder looked up. The exchange had gone exactly as you already know it went. She had stated her assessment. He had dismissed it. He had said the thing he said. What she had not told him in those 2 minutes of conversation was anything about herself. Not her name, not her background, not the 11 confirmed precision fire operations over 6 deployments, or the Force Recon selection record, or the Syria report that was currently sitting in a classified DOJ file less than 400 meters away in the hands of a man who had been trying to find her for 2 years. She had offered the information that was relevant to the immediate tactical problem. He had declined to receive it. She had turned back to her rifle. Torres watched all of this. He was a careful observer. It was part of what made him good at his job. And he filed several things away without speaking them aloud. The way she moved to the rifle without hesitation. The way she had assessed the building before she spoke to them, not after. The slight scar above her right eye that didn't track the way a genuinely impaired eye tracked. The fact that she had given Wilder operational intelligence and he had told her she'd miss, and she had simply stopped talking and gone back to work. He didn't say anything to Wilder. He went back to the breach plan and began, very quietly, to recalculate. Wilder's team moved to the staging position at 1023. Breach was planned for 1040, which gave them time to get the entry element into position, confirm the hostage locations through thermal imaging, and coordinate the simultaneous approach through the front and side entries. The thermal imaging confirmed 5 heat signatures in the East Wing 2nd floor. It also confirmed what Mara had told them. The signatures were not isolated. Each one was adjacent to another signature. Each hostage was being held in direct physical contact with a captor. Wilder looked at the thermal display for a long time. Torres looked at it longer. That changes the breach, Torres said carefully. The breach is the breach, Wilder said. We move on schedule. Chief, if they're using them as shields, we've extracted from worse. Wilder started moving. Stack up. Torres stacked up. He did not look back at the woman by the truck. He wanted to. He didn't. The stack moved toward the building, and Mara Cole picked up her grandfather's rifle. Later, people would ask her why she didn't say more, why she hadn't pushed harder, argued louder, demanded to be heard. The answer she gave, in the quiet and controlled language she used for everything, was this: I said what needed to be said. He heard it. He made his decision. After that, there was only one thing left to do. What was left to do required the following: a Remington 700 custom built by James Cole in 1987, rechambered in .308 Winchester by Mara herself in 2019, fitted with a Night Force Attacker 5 to 25 times 56 scope that she had calibrated at altitude 3 months earlier, because she always calibrated at altitude. A position 70 meters to the northwest of the staging area, prone behind a granite outcropping that gave her a clear view of all 5 east-face windows at an average distance of 393 meters. A crosswind of approximately 8 miles per hour, left to right, gusting occasionally to 11, which she had been monitoring for the past 40 minutes. And 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days of being told she couldn't see clearly enough to do this. She settled into the position. Her heartbeat dropped to 52. Her breathing slowed to a 4-count inhale, 4-count exhale, the rhythm her grandfather had taught her and that she had refined over 30 years until it happened without thought. She looked through the scope with her right eye, the eye with the scar, the eye that Dr. Leonard Krauss had certified as operationally inadequate. Window 1, east face, leftmost. A man with a tactical vest and an AK variant standing behind a hostage, male civilian, early 60s, glasses, DOJ lanyard still visible. The angle was 11 degrees off-center from her position. Wind compensation, 0.7 mils right. Elevation adjustment, minor, accounting for the 8,400 foot altitude and the slight downward angle. She identified him clearly, filed his position, moved to window 2. Window 2, adjacent. Female hostage, late 20s. Captor directly behind her, taller than average, weapon in right hand. His head visible above hers by approximately 4 inches. The shot was there if the timing was right. Windows 3, 4, 5. She mapped them all. Filed the positions the way her grandfather had taught her to file everything. Not in emotion, not in urgency, in geometry. Pure geometry. Angles and distances and the physics of a .308 projectile traveling at 2,680 feet per second through mountain air. The bridge team was 40 meters from the front door. She had approximately 90 seconds. She had taken harder shots with 90 minutes. Her grandfather's voice, patience, and the honesty, being honest about what you're actually seeing. She saw 5 windows. She saw 5 captors. She saw the exact angles at which their skulls were positioned relative to the window frames at this specific moment in time. She exhaled. The first shot took the captor in window 1 at a point of aim that accounted for 0.7 mils of wind drift, and the fact that at 381 meters, a .308 projectile drops approximately 28.4 inches from the muzzle. The shot entered the window at the left edge, angled 11 degrees, and found its target before the sound reached the building. 4 seconds. The second shot required a 0.4 mil adjustment for a slightly different angle, and the momentary drop in wind speed she had tracked with her peripheral vision. She had 3.8 seconds of the captor's head being stationary. She used 3.2 of them. 4 seconds. The third shot was the hardest. The hostage moved, a small involuntary flinch, probably a sound she hadn't expected, and the margin reduced from 4 inches to just under 2. Mara held the trigger pressure. Held. The hostage's shoulder dropped half an inch as the flinch resolved itself. She fired. 4 seconds. The fourth shot was clean. The simplest angle of the 5, almost directly perpendicular to the window face. She almost thought that, then caught herself. Her grandfather, simple shots are only simple until you assume they are. She applied full concentration to a simple shot and made it look easy because it was not easy, and she knew it was not easy. 4 seconds. The fifth shot was the one that people would discuss later in the debrief, in the classified reports, and eventually in the testimony that none of them knew was coming. The captor in window 5 had shifted position between the time she had set her solution and the time she was ready to fire. He had moved 3 inches to the right, partially behind the window frame, leaving a clear target area of approximately 2.5 inches. A 2.5-inch target at 401 meters through a 16-inch window in an 8-mile-per-hour crosswind. She thought of her grandfather's brass scope cap, worn smooth from 20 years of his thumb running across it, then 20 more of hers, engraved in letters small enough to require reading glasses he would never have admitted to needing. See it clearly or don't shoot. She saw it clearly. She fired. 19 seconds for 5 shots. Not because she was rushing, because that was the correct pace, the pace at which the targets presented themselves in sequence, the pace at which the geometry resolved itself one window at a time. 18 meters from the front door, Wilder's breech team froze as 5 shots cracked across the mountain in rapid succession. Then nothing. No return fire. No screaming. No sounds of contact. The radio crackled. A voice from inside, Torres, who had gone in as part of the stack and was now standing in the entry hall with his weapon raised and nothing to shoot at. Wilder. All 5 east wing targets are down. Hostages are uninjured. Repeat, all 5 hostages are uninjured. I don't know who fired. I don't have eyes on a friendly position. Wilder stood in the staging area. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned around. She was already ejecting the spent cases, collecting them methodically from the ground around her position. Old habit. She didn't look at him. That's he started. She picked up the 5th case and dropped it into the small bag she kept for exactly this purpose. That's impossible, he said. Those windows, the angle on window 5 alone, the angle on window 5 is 7.3 degrees off perpendicular at 401 meters in an 8-mile-per-hour crosswind, she said. She said it the way she said everything, not as a demonstration, not to make a point, but because it was the accurate description of what had happened. The target area was 2.4 inches. You need approximately a quarter OA group to make that shot with reasonable confidence. Applause. What's your quarter OA group at 400 meters? Torres asked. He had appeared at the edge of the staging area without anyone noticing him move there. His voice was very careful. She looked at him, consistent. Torres made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else. Wilder hadn't moved. He was still looking at her with the expression of a man whose internal model of the world had just developed a serious crack. "Who are you?" he said. It was not the first time a man had asked her that question after watching her work. It would not be the last. And like every other time she had been asked it, she gave the same answer. Mara Cole, Tactical Environment Design. I've been here 18 months. Applause. You didn't ask when you arrived. The hostages came out of the building 12 minutes later, escorted by Torres and 3 other members of the tactical team who had cleared the structure room by room in the aftermath of the shots. The Cascade Covenant members who had taken the facility were in varying states of disarray. some surrendering immediately, some requiring physical persuasion, one attempting to reach a weapon and being persuaded otherwise by Torres in a manner that was efficient and left no permanent damage. Wilder stood in the staging area and watched his team work with the particular expression of a commanding officer who is recalculating something he doesn't want to recalculate. The hostages emerged into the November mountain air, looking the way people always looked when the thing they expected to kill them didn't. Shaky, grateful, not entirely certain the world was real yet. The two facility staff members, Chen and Rodriguez, were immediately surrounded by their co-workers and wrapped in emergency blankets. The two junior DOJ staffers hugged each other with the intensity of people who had never expected to hug anyone again. Douglas Hartley emerged last. He was 61 years old. Built like someone who had once been an athlete and retained the structure, if not the condition, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular bearing of a man who had spent decades in rooms where things were decided. He came out of the door and stopped at the top of the steps and looked across the staging area with the methodical attention of someone assessing a situation. His eyes found Mara. He crossed the staging area in measured strides, past the emergency responders and the tactical team and Wilder, who tracked his movement but didn't intercept it. He stopped in front of her. "Master Sergeant Cole," he said. She looked at him. "I'm Douglas Hartley, Department of Justice, National Security Division." He reached into his jacket, slowly, with the careful body language of a man who understood that the woman in front of him had just demonstrated her capabilities in the most direct possible way, and produced an identification card that he held steady for her to examine. "I know who you are, Mr. Hartley." She had read his credentials on Monday. She had known he was DOJ. She had not known what he wanted until their conversation had begun. "We spoke on Monday." "We did. You didn't let me finish." He glanced past her at Wilder, who was now approximately 15 feet away and not pretending to be doing anything other than listening. "I'd like to finish now, if you're willing." She studied him for a moment. "What were you going to tell me?" He reached into the inside breast pocket of his jacket, the same methodical, telegraphed movement, and produced a folded document. Several pages, dense with text, with a classification stamp at the top that she recognized immediately. She looked at the stamp. She looked at the document. "That's my after-action report," she said. Her voice didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a tightening, the closest thing to visible emotion she had permitted herself in a long time. "It is," Hartley said. "The original, properly filed and date stamped. I've had it for 8 months. It took 2 years to locate and an additional 6 months to authenticate beyond the level of doubt that would hold up in a federal proceeding." She was still looking at the document. "I've also obtained," he continued, "the original medical records from your review, the records of the physician who conducted it, and documentation establishing that the assessment was fraudulent. The diagnosis was fabricated to support a predetermined administrative outcome." Behind her, she heard boots on gravel. She didn't turn around. She knew from the sound that it was Wilder. "Mr. Hartley?" Wilder's voice had acquired a new texture. It was still controlled, still carrying the practiced authority of a senior operator, but something underneath it had gone tight. "This is an active incident scene. Anything beyond initial emergency operations needs to go through proper channels." Hartley turned to look at him with the patience of a man who had been dealing with military protocol for 30 years and had stopped being impressed by it. "Master Chief Wilder," he said. "Yes, I know who you are." Wilder went very still. "The investigation I'm conducting," Hartley continued, in the same measured tone, "includes testimony from 4 individuals who were present at an operation in northeastern Syria on November 14th of 4 years ago. It includes signals intelligence recovered from the jammed communications frequency that was active during that operation. And it includes the after-action report that is currently in my hand, filed by Master Sergeant Cole within 6 hours of returning to base. The staging area had gone quiet. Not all at once. It happened gradually, the way conversations stop when people realize they're overhearing something significant. The emergency responders kept moving, but the tactical team had gone still, and Torres was standing close enough to hear every word. The investigation, Hartley said, is complete. The findings have been presented to the Attorney General and are currently under seal pending the announcement of charges. Those charges will be announced on Thursday. He looked at Wilder with flat, undramatic certainty of someone delivering news that is simply true. You should be aware of that. Wilder said nothing. He said nothing for a very long time. Mara watched him with the same calm she brought to everything. She watched the thing happen to his face that she had seen happen to faces before. The moment when a man who had built an entire structure of safety and certainty understands that the structure has been compromised at the foundation. It was not satisfaction she felt watching it. It was something more complicated than that, something that would take her a while to name. You came here for her, Wilder said finally to Hartley. Not a question, among other things. Hartley folded the document and returned it to his pocket. She was the primary witness we were unable to reach through official channels. Her file had been flagged in ways that made direct DOJ contact problematic. I needed to speak with her in a setting that couldn't be easily monitored. He glanced toward the building where the Cascade Covenant had been until 40 minutes ago. This was not the setting I had in mind. The Covenant, Mara said. They were here for you. Someone told them I was here, Hartley said. Someone who didn't want this conversation to happen. He looked at Wilder again. Not accusingly, just precisely. Wilder's jaw was working. He was calculating something. She could see it, running through options and outcomes the way operators ran through tactical scenarios. She had done it herself many times. She knew what it looked like when the math stopped working. I want to speak to a lawyer, Wilder said. That's your right, Hartley said simply. You should also know that an FBI field team is currently en route. They'll be here in approximately 40 minutes. In the meantime, Chief Torres is going to ask you to remain in the staging area. Torres stepped forward. He did it without drama, without the aggressive stance that some men used in these situations. He simply moved to a position that made the request physical as well as verbal. Chief, Torres said quietly, not to Wilder, to the situation. Wilder looked at Torres for a moment. Then he looked at Mara. She looked back at him. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the last 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days hadn't already said, silently, invisibly, in the subtracted space she had occupied, while the thing she knew burned through channels she hadn't known, existed, until a DOJ investigator came to the mountains to find her. Wilder looked away first. The FBI arrived in 38 minutes, which was 2 minutes faster than Hartley had estimated. They came in 3 vehicles, 2 sedans, and a tactical van that suggested they had been briefed on the nature of the situation at the facility. What happened next was procedural and methodical and largely unremarkable in its mechanics, which is often how the most significant things happen. Forms were filed. Statements were taken. Chain of custody was established for the documents in Hartley's possession and for the Remington 700, which was catalogued as relevant to the incident scene before being returned to Mara with a receipt that struck her as somehow phony in a way she couldn't entirely explain. Wilder, was escorted to one of the FBI sedans with the particular formality that the Bureau used when they wanted the distinction to be clear. Not an arrest, not yet, but a conversation that would not end quickly and would happen somewhere with four walls and a recording device. He walked to the car without assistance. She gave him that. She watched the sedan until it was past the main gate and the pine trees closed behind it. Torres appeared at her left. "He's been building to that for a long time," Torres said. He was looking at the gate, not at her. Some of us knew the Syria Opal wasn't clean. Nobody wanted to be the one to say it. She considered this for a moment. Why not? Because he was the kind of CEO that made not saying it feel like the right choice. Torres turned to look at her. "Doesn't make it right. Just makes it human." She nodded slowly. "I filed the report." "Yeah." Something moved through Torres' expression, complicated and honest, and not entirely comfortable. "I know. We know what happened after you filed the report. We've known for a while." A pause. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what it's worth." It was worth something. She wasn't certain what yet. She said so. Torres almost smiled. He went back to managing his team. Hartley found her an hour later, sitting on the tailgate of her truck with her grandfather's rifle partially disassembled across her lap. She was cleaning it with the focused meditative attention she always brought to this task. The ritual that had been, for many years, one of the few things that felt completely honest. He sat down in the camp chair that someone had set up near the staging area and watched her work for a moment before speaking. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "about why I came here the way I did." "You owed me information," she said, running the cleaning rod through the barrel in the slow, precise motion her grandfather had demonstrated so many times she could do it in the dark. "The explanation is secondary." "Fair enough." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "The investigation has been running for 2 years. We identified you as the primary documentary witness 14 months ago. Every attempt to make direct contact through official channels was flagged. Someone in the intelligence community had access to our communication logs and was monitoring for your name. We had to come at it sideways. A consultation at a remote training facility. That was publicly scheduled for an entirely different purpose and that you had no obvious reason to be associated with in the eyes of anyone monitoring my movements." He looked at the building. "Until someone made the connection anyway. The Covenant. The Covenant is a domestic extremist group that has been used as an irregular asset by at least one person in the intelligence community for the last 18 months. They're not sophisticated, but they're deniable, and they had my travel itinerary 3 days ago." He paused. "They were supposed to prevent this conversation from happening. They did not succeed." She set down the cleaning rod and looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. "What does it mean, for my record?" Hartley was quiet for a moment, in the way of a careful man who didn't want to make promises he couldn't control the outcome of. "I can tell you what the findings establish. The medical assessment that resulted in your discharge was fraudulent. The records were falsified by Dr. Leonard Krauss at the request of an officer whose identity I cannot yet confirm, was Wilder, but who the evidence strongly implicates. The discharge itself was therefore invalid." She absorbed this. The question of what happens next, reinstatement, back pay, correction of record, those are processes that will take time and will involve agencies and offices that I don't directly control. He met her eyes. "But the evidence is clean. The case is solid. And the testimony that you gave in the 6 hours after Syria, before anyone could touch it, is the foundation of all of it." She looked down at the rifle in her lap. "I filed that report because it was true," she said, "not because I thought it would matter." "It mattered," Hartley said simply. "It just took a long time." She thought about that. 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. She thought about her grandfather on the wooden platform in Wyoming, telling an 11-year-old girl to be honest about what she was actually seeing. The truth had a half-life longer than anyone who tried to bury it could plan for. She had not known that when she filed the report. She had been hoping for it, the way you hope for something you can't control, which is not quite faith and not quite certainty, but something in the specific space between them. My grandfather used to say, she said, that the truth doesn't need your help to survive. It just needs you not to lie about it in the first place. Hartley considered this. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was, she said. She began reassembling the rifle. It was getting dark by the time the FBI wrapped their initial scene documentation and began the process of removing the Covenant members who had been secured in the facility's equipment base. The mountain cold that lived above 8,000 feet had asserted itself with the sunset, dropping the temperature 15 degrees in 40 minutes the way it always did. And people had found jackets and gloves without being told. Mara was standing near her truck, watching the vehicles maneuver on the gravel access road, when she heard boots approaching from behind. Light footfall, young. She turned. Lance Corporal Cameron Reyes was 23 years old. She had been the junior member of Wilder's team, the only woman, the newest operator, the one who had been standing at the back of the staging area when Wilder had made his comment and who had said nothing and looked at the ground. She was not looking at the ground now. She was standing at attention, with the particular precision of someone who had decided what they were about to say mattered enough to say it properly. Ma'am, Lance Corporal. Reyes' jaw was set. Her eyes were direct. There was something behind them that Mara recognized, not the bright anger of impulse, but the slower, deeper kind that comes from watching something and not liking it, and deciding that not liking it isn't enough. I want to give a statement, Reyes said, to the investigators about what I observed today. Master Chief Wilder's conduct toward you when we arrived. The information you provided and how it was received. The shots you made and the outcome. She paused. All of it. Mara looked at her for a moment. That's your right. It's also your prerogative to let it go and move on. Yes, ma'am. Reyes did not move. I don't want to let it go. Why not? It was a real question, not a test. She was genuinely asking. Reyes was quiet for a moment, the silence of someone finding the accurate words, not stalling. Because I've been in that staging area 3 times now, she said. 3 different operations, 3 different scenarios. And every time there's a woman in the room who knows something that matters, I watch the same thing happen. The thing Wilder did today. Different words, same decision. She paused. And every time, the men around me say nothing. And neither do I, because it's easier. Because he's the CO. Because speaking up creates problems, and staying quiet doesn't. Another pause. Except it does. It created this problem. 4 years of it. Mara watched her. Somebody has to, Reyes said. And I'm the person who saw it. So I'm the person who has to be the one. Silence stretched between them for a moment. Not uncomfortable. The kind that happens when something true has been said and both people are acknowledging it. Your father's unit, Mara said. What branch? Reyes blinked. How did you know? The way you hold your weapon. Right shoulder, left eye dominant. It's a specific pattern. It's trained, not natural, which means someone taught you before the Marine Corps got to you. She paused. Family? My father. He was Army. 75th Ranger Regiment. Served 96 to 2008. Reyes' expression shifted slightly. Something warm moving through the precision. He taught me to shoot when I was 8. Said it was important to know how to do something right before someone taught you to do it wrong. Mara was quiet for a moment. Good philosophy, she said. She put her hand in her jacket pocket. Her fingers found the brass scope cap, her grandfather's, carried so long the metal had warmed to her body temperature before she even touched it. The engraving wasn't smooth but still legible if you knew to look. She brought it out and held it for a moment, looking at it in the fading mountain light. Then she held it out toward Reyes. The young Marine looked at it, at the engraving. "What does it say?" she asked. "See it clearly," Mara said, "or don't shoot." A pause. "My grandfather gave it to me when I was 11. Said it was the only rule that mattered." Reyes looked at the cap, then at Mara. "I can't take this." "You can and you will." Mara pressed it into her hand and closed the young Marine's fingers around it. "You already know what it means. You proved it today by not looking at the ground when you had the chance to." Reyes held it carefully, as if it was something that could break, though it was solid brass and had survived 40 years of pockets and operations, and one woman's 4 years of imposed invisibility without a scratch. She looked up. "Ma'am, what are you going to do now?" It was the question Mara had been turning over since Hartley had folded the document back into his pocket. The question she didn't have a clean answer to. What did you do when the thing that had been used against you turned out to be a lie? And the lie unraveled not in a single dramatic moment, but in the quiet procedural machinery of an investigation that would take months to fully resolve. What did you do with 4 years of practiced invisibility when the reason for it was gone? She looked out at the pines, at the last edge of light on the ridgeline. "I don't know," she said. And then, because it was honest, "That's the first time I've said that in 4 years." Reyes almost smiled. "Good answer," she said softly. Mara picked up her grandfather's rifle case and put it in the truck. She got in the driver's side and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel looking at the facility, at the building where 5 people had survived because of 19 seconds of geometry and precision, and the absolute refusal to accept a lie about what she could and couldn't see. She thought about her grandfather, about the wooden platform and the Remington 700, and the lesson about honesty that had turned out to be the most durable thing he'd ever given her, more durable than the rifle, and more durable than the scope cap now in the hands of a young Marine who would carry it forward into things Mara couldn't predict. She thought about the report she had filed at 23:40 hours on a November night 4 years ago. In the flat, factual language of after-action documentation, in the honest, unflinching description of what she had actually seen, the truth didn't need your help to survive. It just needed you not to lie about it in the first place. She had not lied. She had waited. And now she was sitting in a 12-year-old truck at 8,400 feet above sea level on a Tuesday evening in November. And for the first time in 4 years, 2 months and 11 days, she did not know what came next. She started the engine. She drove up the access road toward her cabin, toward the tomatoes that were already finished for the season, and the rosemary bush that had no business surviving at altitude, and the 8 miles of dark mountain road she would run in the morning at 05:30, the way she ran it every morning. And then, for the first time in a long time, maybe further than that, toward whatever war was on the other side of the thing that had ended today. She didn't know what was there. She hadn't let herself imagine it these 4 years. Imagination required a future, and she had not permitted herself a future. She permitted it now. It felt, she realized, the specific feeling of not knowing what came next and not needing to, like the moment before the exhale. The moment when everything is in alignment, and the only thing left to do is release. She exhaled. The truck moved through the pines. The headlights swept the road. The mountain held its silence the way mountains do, not empty, but full of things that don't require announcement. Mara Cole drove on, Not hiding, not invisible, just moving, just beginning. In the parking lot of the facility, Lance Corporal Cameron Reyes stood alone for a moment in the dark. She opened her hand and looked at the brass scope cap in the pale light from the building. See it clearly, or don't shoot. She closed her fingers around it, put it in her breast pocket against her chest. Then she went to find an investigator and tell him everything she had seen. Because someone had to, and she was the person who had seen it. So, she was the person who had to be the one. Torres had been watching the building for 6 minutes when he noticed the inconsistency. The thermal imaging was good, military grade, the kind that could read heat signatures through 12 inches of standard construction. But it required interpretation, and Torres had been interpreting thermal for 19 years. He knew what a person holding a weapon looked like at 380 meters. He knew the difference between a hostage on the left side of a room and a hostage on the right. He knew the specific way a human silhouette changed shape when the person it belonged to was frightened. What he was seeing in Window 3 did not look like a clean breach scenario. "Chief," he said carefully. "I see it," Wilder said. "Window 3. The captor has the hostage fully shielded. The angle on the entry hall means..." "I know what the angle means, Torres." Torres was quiet for a moment. The woman at the truck said the east-face windows were accessible from the northwest tree line at approximately 390 meters. "She's a civilian contractor." She moved like she wasn't. Wilder looked at him with the flat attention of a CO who has heard pushback and is determining whether to engage with it. "She moved like she knew what she was doing," Torres said. "Whatever else she is, she knows that building and she knows angles. She's not on my team." "No, but her information might be accurate." Wilder looked back at the thermal display. Something moved through his face. A flicker of uncertainty, there and gone. He was not a stupid man. In the field, that mattered more than people gave it credit for. Stupid men got people killed through ignorance. Certain men got people killed through refusal. Grant Wilder's problem was not stupidity. "Stack up," he said. Torres stacked up. He did not look at the woman by the truck. He wanted to. The Remington's bipod was worn at the legs from 20 years of prone positions across 4 continents and 2 climates that hated metal. Mara noticed this every time she deployed it. Noticed it the way you notice things you've decided not to fix because they still work perfectly, and changing them would feel like losing something. Her grandfather had deployed the same bipod on 2 continents of his own. She settled into position behind a granite outcropping. The outcropping was not an accident of her choosing. She had identified it 3 months after arriving at the facility, on a morning when the light was doing something interesting to the east face of the main building, and she had spent 20 minutes working out the geometry with her spotting scope purely out of the professional habit of reading terrain. She had written nothing down. She hadn't needed to. The angles lived in her head the way all spatial information lived there, not memorized but integrated, like vocabulary. Left to right wind, 8 miles per hour at the shooting position, 9.5 miles per hour at the midpoint of the flight path, based on the flag behavior she had been watching on the facility's main pole for the last 42 minutes. The Remington 700 in .308 had a ballistic coefficient that meant the crosswind would push the projectile 2.8 inches at 380 meters and 3.4 inches at 410. She had already set her wind edge to 0.6 miles right, which was the average for the range. She would make individual adjustments for each shot based on the specific distance and the instantaneous wind read. This was not sophisticated. This was arithmetic. Her grandfather had taught her arithmetic when she was 9 and told her she would use it the rest of her life in ways school wouldn't cover. She placed her cheek against the stock, found the eye relief, looked through the scope with her right eye, the eye with the scar above it, the eye that Dr. Leonard Krauss had certified as operationally inadequate, the eye that had been making shots like this for 20 years and intended to make them for 20 more. The breach team was moving. She could see them at the edge of her peripheral vision, 40 meters out from the front entry. Window 1. She settled the crosshair, read the wind, made the adjustment. Heart rate, 51 beats per minute. She could feel it, not as a problem, as information. Her grandfather, your heartbeat is just your body asking if you're ready. Answer it. She was ready. Window 1. Captor position, left of center, 381 meters. Target area approximately 6 inches of exposed head and upper shoulder above the hostage. Wind adjustment, 0.7 mils right. Elevation, natural point of aim, plus 1.4 mils for distance and altitude. She exhaled. The trigger broke at 3.2 pounds of pressure. She had set it there herself. 2 pounds lighter than the factory configuration because her grandfather had believed in triggers that didn't require decisions. The rifle spoke. She was already moving to window 2. The thing about previous sequential shots at different distances through different angles in a sustained wind was not the shooting. The shooting was arithmetic. The thing was the transition, the speed at which you moved from one solution to the next without carrying any of the previous shot into the new calculation. Each window was a new problem. The math from window 1 was irrelevant to window 2. You had to be willing to release it completely and start over. Most shooters, under pressure, couldn't do this. The previous shot occupied cognitive space, either because it went well and you wanted to repeat it, or because it went wrong and you were compensating. Either way, you were shooting the last shot instead of the next one. Her grandfather had called this shooting your memory instead of the target. She did not shoot her memory. Window 2, 395 meters. Captor standing directly behind the hostage, head 4 inches above her shoulder. Wind 8.5 miles per hour at time of shot, a slight gust that she read from the flags and the movement of the fine branches at the tree line to her left. Adjustment, 0.65 miles right. The gust would peak and taper in approximately 2 seconds. She waited 1.8 seconds and fired into the taper. The sound of the shot reached the building before the captor processed what had happened. He didn't process it at all. Window 3. The hostage had moved. An involuntary flinch, probably the sound of the first shot carrying through the building's structure, a vibration more than a noise, but enough to trigger the body's instinct. The margin reduced from 6 inches to 2.1 inches of clear target. Mara held. Her grandfather, patience is just honesty applied to time. You're being honest about the fact that the shot isn't ready yet. The hostage's shoulder dropped as the flinch resolved. The target margin opened to 2.8 inches. She fired. Window 4. Clean. Almost perpendicular. She caught herself beginning to relax into the easier geometry and applied full concentration instead, because her grandfather had told her that simple shots went wrong when you assumed they were simple. 4.1 seconds. Window 5. The captor had shifted. She saw it in the scope, a movement of 3 inches to the right, partially behind the window frame, leaving 2.4 inches of clear target area at 401 meters. The wind at this moment was reading 8 miles per hour, steady, no gust variation. The angle from her position to window 5 was 7.3 degrees off perpendicular, which required a slight horizontal elevation, compensation that her scope was not configured for and that she applied through instinct. through the integrated geometry that 20 years of looking through glass had built into her nervous system like a second language. She thought of the brass scope cap, not because she needed to, because it was there, the way her grandfather was always there, not as a voice, not as a memory, but as the foundation of everything she knew how to do. See it clearly. She saw it clearly. She fired. The rifle went still. She remained in position, breathing, scanning. Old discipline, the habit of not assuming you were finished just because you felt finished. 19 seconds had elapsed from first shot to fifth. 5 windows, 5 captors, 5 hostages still breathing. No friendly casualties. She began ejecting the spent cases. Later, at the debrief table, one of the FBI investigators, a woman named Chen, which Mara noted without comment, asked her to describe the process. You fired 5 rounds in 19 seconds at distances ranging from 381 to 401 meters, in variable crosswind, to windows 16 inches wide, with live hostages as partial obstructions, Chen said. She was reading from a form, but her eyes were on Mara. Can you walk me through the decision-making process? It wasn't a decision-making process, Mara said. Chen looked up from the form. It was a solving process. The decisions were made before I went to the position. I had identified the target parameters, assessed the environmental factors, set up the ballistic solutions. When I looked through the scope, I wasn't deciding anything. I was checking whether the solution I'd already built matched the conditions in front of me. She paused. Mostly it did. And window 3? Chen asked. Window 3 required a hold. The conditions weren't ready. You waited 1.8 seconds. I waited until they were ready. Chen looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something on her form. One more question, she said. Master Chief Wilder told you the shots were impossible before you fired. He said I'd miss. Did that affect your process? Mara considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. No, she said. What he said about it wasn't a part of the math. A pause. The math was the math. Chen wrote something else on her form. Outside the window, the mountain was dark and the stars were beginning. The kind of stars you only saw at altitude. Not the scattered handful that made it through city light, but the full overwhelming density of the actual sky. Mara looked at them for a moment while Chen finished her notes. She thought about a wooden platform in Wyoming. She thought about a girl who had been taught to be honest about what she saw. She thought about 4 years of being invisible, and 5 shots that had not been, and a brass scope cap in the pocket of a young Marine who was, at this moment, giving her statement in the next room. She thought about what came next. She still didn't know, but the not knowing she was beginning to understand was not the same as being lost. It was the same as being free. There is a specific kind of discipline required to become invisible when you are not, by nature, a person who disappears. Mara Cole had spent her entire adult life in roles where being seen was the point. Not seen the way a performer is seen, but seen the way a weapon is seen, recognized, assessed, deployed. She had spent 10 years earning the kind of professional visibility that existed in classified briefings and operational after-action reports, in the quiet nods of senior officers who knew what a specific record meant, and in the field assessments of commanders who had watched her work and updated their understanding of what was possible. That visibility had been taken from her at 800 on a Wednesday morning by a 45-minute medical review and a man with a form that had already been filled out. What she had built instead, in the 4 years and change that followed, was not peace. It wasn't even acceptance. It was the functional equivalent of both, a life reduced to its essential components, like a rifle broken down to its constituent parts. Stock, barrel, action, trigger. The things that had to work. The things she had decided to keep. She had kept the running. 8 miles a day in the dark at altitude, because her body remembered what it was supposed to do, and she saw no reason to let it forget. She had kept the precision. Not with weapons, she had kept the Remington, but she had not used it for 2 years, until the morning she noticed that the distance from the northwest tree line to the east face of the training building was exactly 393 meters on average, and the thing in her that could not stop calculating trajectories had worked out the rest without being asked. She kept the precision in the scenarios she designed, in the environments she built for other people to train in, the same attention to geometry, the same respect for the math. She had kept the honesty, not the brutal confrontational kind. She had never been that kind of person, and she had not become one. The quiet kind. The kind that didn't let her pretend she didn't know what had happened or why or who had done it. The kind that meant she filed every morning's run in her memory the same way she had filed every field assessment, accurately without embellishment or softening. These were the essential components. Everything else, the career, the operational identity, the specific professional self that had been built over 20 years, those had been removed. Not by her choice, but they had been removed, and she had decided, in the period immediately after the discharge, that she had 2 options: spend the rest of her life in opposition to the removal, or learn to function around it. She had chosen function. She had not known, when she made that choice, that choosing function was not the same as accepting the lie. James Cole had died 18 months before her discharge. Heart attack at 72 on the ranch in Wyoming, where he had spent 40 years turning himself from a combat veteran into something more useful, which was a man who could teach. He had been planting a fence post when it happened, found by a neighbor an hour later already gone, with the dignity of a man who died working. She had been in the field when she received the notification. She had not been able to attend the service. She had driven to Wyoming 8 months later, in the dead of winter, and spent 3 days alone in his empty ranch house. She had gone through his shop, the workbench where he had built and modified more firearms than she could count, where he had built the Remington she still carried. She had found, in a wooden box under the bench, with her name on a piece of masking tape, the following items: the brass scope cap, which she had known about since she was 11, a handwritten letter, 3 pages, in his blocky, careful script that covered the years from her enlistment to the present tense as he had known it. Specific and honest, as everything he wrote was, about what he was proud of, about what he hoped for, about the thing he had always believed about her, that she sometimes had trouble believing about herself. And a smaller piece of paper torn from a notebook with 2 sentences in pencil. The truth has a longer half-life than anyone trying to bury it can account for. Wait it out. She had sat in his empty shop for a long time with that piece of paper. She had put it in her jacket pocket. She had driven back to Colorado and applied for the civilian consulting position at the Rocky Mountain Training Center. And every morning since, she had run 8 miles in the dark and thought about arithmetic and waited for something she couldn't name. She had been waiting for Douglas Hartley. She hadn't known that, but she had been waiting. The training center had given her something she hadn't expected, which was students, not in a formal sense. Her role was scenario design, not instruction. But the units that came through the facility were young, in the aggregate, and they had questions, and the woman who had designed the environments they were training in had answers that were neither theoretical nor borrowed from a textbook. She had made a practice of being available without being intrusive, of being in the copy room at 0600 when early risers came through, of being visible near the equipment base when teams were doing the pre-op checks and someone needed a second opinion on a load configuration. She had never once mentioned her service record. She had never needed to. What she said was accurate, and the accuracy was its own credential. There had been, over 18 months, perhaps a dozen conversations that she thought of later as significant. A young sniper from the 75th Ranger Regiment who had a mechanical problem with his trigger pull that 3 instructors had failed to diagnose and that Mara had identified in 40 seconds from watching him dry fire. A Marine Lance Corporal who had a question about reading terrain at altitude that went on for 2 hours and that Mara had answered completely without condescension until the young woman understood not just the technique, but the principle behind it. Small things. The kind of things that didn't make reports and didn't get commendations and didn't appear in any record. The kind of things that her grandfather had spent 30 years doing on a ranch in Wyoming, with the conviction that it mattered. She had not known, on the day Wilder's team arrived, that one of the people in it was the same Marine Lance Corporal from 2 years earlier. She had not connected the name to the face in the moment, because there were names and faces and 2 years was long enough for both to shift. She had recognized it afterward. The young woman with the right shoulder and the left eye dominance, who had looked at the ground when Wilder made his comment and had spent the rest of the day becoming the person who would not look away. Cameron Reyes, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, her father's unit, different generation, the kind of thread that ran through things, if you paid attention. Her grandfather had paid attention to threads. She was learning to do the same. The conversation with Hartley on Monday had lasted 40 minutes before the consultation schedule pulled him to a briefing with the facility's senior staff. He had covered, in those 40 minutes, the general framework of his investigation without specifying the details, asking questions that seemed directional rather than investigative, about her service timeline, about the Syria deployment specifically, about the sequence of events following her return to the forward operating base. He had been careful. She had noticed the carefulness. She had wondered about it, but had not been alarmed by it. Men with careers in federal law enforcement developed a specific quality of patience, and she had enough of her own to recognize it in others. He had gotten as far as the November operation. He had asked her, with the specific precision of someone approaching a subject from an angle, what she had been doing on the 14th of November at approximately 1400 hours. Overwatch, she had said, fire support. And then Paula had knocked on the conference room door and said the afternoon session was starting. And then, on Tuesday morning, 12 armed men had come through the gate. She had thought about those 40 minutes, in the hours after the shots, in the space where the adrenaline metabolized, and what remained was the quiet clarity of a situation that had been resolved but not concluded. She had thought about how close the timing had been. 1 more hour with Hartley on Monday, and she would have known everything she needed to know before the Covenant arrived. She had decided eventually that the timing didn't matter. What mattered was what it led to. The shots had been the shots. 19 seconds of arithmetic in a crosswind. The outcome of 20 years of learning to see clearly, and 3 decades of a grandfather's voice telling her that honesty was not just a moral position, but a practical one, that it was ultimately the only thing that kept you from shooting your memory instead of the target. What followed the shots was something different. Not resolution, not quite. Resolution would take months, and the DOJ and the specific grinding machinery of federal justice that Hartley had set in motion 2 years ago with the patience of a man who understood that truth had a longer half-life than anyone trying to bury it could account for. Her grandfather had known that. He had told her to wait it out. She had waited. And now she was on the other side of the wait. And the other side looked like this: a November mountain at 8,400 feet, and a truck engine turning over in the cold air, and the road home through the pines lit by the headlights that could only reach so far ahead before the darkness took over. This was all right. She had been driving into the dark her whole life. She knew how to use the light she had. 3 months later, in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., a grand jury returned an indictment on 7 counts. Mara was not in the courtroom. She was in Wyoming, standing in a field that had once been her grandfather's, looking at the fence post he had been planting when he died. Someone had finished it. One of the neighbors, probably, or the ranch hand who had taken over the property. It stood properly set, plumb and solid, the way he would have wanted it. She stood there for a while. She thought about the wooden platform, the Remington, the patience. She thought about Cameron Reyes and the brass scope cap, and what it meant to hand something forward into the hands of someone who understood what they were receiving. She thought about the 5 shots and the 19 seconds and the complete undramatic mathematics of seeing clearly. She had received the previous week a letter from the Marine Corps Personnel Management Division informing her that her discharge record was under formal administrative review, pending the outcome of federal proceedings. It was not reinstatement. It was not an apology. It was the first bureaucratic acknowledgement that something had been wrong, and it had arrived in a standard envelope with no ceremony, which was appropriate, because that was how these things actually happened in the real world. Not in dramatic moments in staging areas, but in letters and the forms and the slow grinding of institutional correction. She had read it 3 times. Then she had put it in the wooden box under her grandfather's workbench, next to the piece of notebook paper with 2 sentences in pencil, and gone for her morning run. 8 miles, in the dark, at altitude. The rosemary bush, when she got back, was doing fine. She had always known it would.